This is the Marin Alpine Trail XR, and I like to think that that stands for extra radical. This all-mountain monster cost $4,000 at time of filming, which is actually kind of a bargain, but more on that later. Marin did send me this bike for review, which I can't thank them enough for. They make some really impressive bikes, so thank you so much, Marin. I truly appreciate it. I will start off this review by saying I'm not the biggest fan of longer travel bikes. For where I live and 95% of the riding I do, I find longer travel bikes to be a bit overkill for me. Even though I do prefer shorter travel trail bikes, I wanted to expand my horizons and try out something different, something radical. And this bike is exactly that. Will this bike change my opinion on longer travel bikes? Well, we'll try and answer that in this video today. Looking at the geometry really quick of this size large, it has a 63.5 degree head tube angle with a 78 degree seat tube angle. The reach is 480 millimeters, right where I like it, and this is the longest wheelbase bike I've ever ridden at 1,256 millimeters. With 160 millimeters of travel out front, 150 millimeters out back, you're getting top shelf RockShox suspension with a Lyric Ultimate and a Super Deluxe Coil Ultimate. That is $1,500 worth of suspension right there, and most aluminum bikes for $4,000, they're coming with more mid-grade stuff. This bike is near direct-to-consumer level value. Other spec highlights include an XT rear derailleur with SLX shifter and cassette, FSA gradient cranks, and Maxxis Assegai tires front and rear. Although I hate those tires because they are far too sluggish for most riding, they certainly aren't a cheap tire. The low point in the spec for me is the Shimano MT420 brakes. They are 4-piston brakes, which is nice to see, but they do come with the 2-finger levers, and on a big bike like this that's designed for descending, I would prefer to see a slightly more powerful brake. One other thing to criticize is the dropper post. The post itself, the X-Fusion Manic, works perfectly fine. I have nothing wrong with that, but this size large comes spec'd with 150 millimeters of drop, which is just way too short for this bike. This is where my saddle needs to be for me to pedal around, and look how much post is sticking out. That is absurd. It doesn't look good at all. If this came spec'd with a 200 millimeter dropper post that you could shim down to 170, I think that would cover pretty much everyone. Can we please develop that, mountain bike industry? I don't need ABS on my bike. Just give me a post that fits the bike. All things considered though, you're getting a ton of great parts for the price. I weighed the bike before filming this, so as it currently sits, this bike weighs 36.86 pounds. Certainly not a light bike, but I don't think anyone expected it to be. Okay, let's go ahead and talk riding impressions. Starting off with climbing, this is the first bike I've ever ridden with a rear coil shock, and I do have to say, this is the most planted bike I've ever ridden. If you haven't ridden a coil shock before, the best way I can describe it is it kind of feels like there's less air pressure in your rear tire. It almost feels like it's under 20 PSI just because it's so grippy and you can feel it kind of wafting through its travel as you pedal a little bit. It's a strange sensation at first. You get used to it, but there's just so much traction here. I don't think I've ever spun out my rear wheel on a loose climb on this bike. While the traction on this bike is incredible, it's still very long and heavy, and you're going to notice that while climbing. If your climb consists of a lot of tight switchbacks, you're going to be working a little bit harder to navigate this bike than you would on a shorter travel, smaller wheelbase bike. Going up a fire road, this bike is fine, but you're probably not going to beat your friends to the top, unless you're just really physically fit. There were a couple months where I was riding this bike pretty much exclusively, and you kind of get used to it. The weight you don't seem to notice as much until you ride something else like my Giant Trance. This bike isn't designed with climbing efficiency as the #1 importance, so I'm guessing none of you are surprised by my evaluation of it. On the positive side, you'll probably build some nice leg muscles from pedaling this bike up hills, like these. I'm not going to show you my legs, you're just going to have to take my word that they look fantastic. As a day-to-day trail bike, this thing does a decent job. I would say if you live in a flatter area with slow to medium speed trails, I would try to stick to the more flowy stuff if you want to have a better time. I did some slower tech riding on this bike, and as I kind of expected, I wasn't blown away by its performance, but I don't think it was designed with slow tech riding in mind either. On more flowy sections, as you get comfortable with the length of the bike and the feeling from the coil shock, this thing is really fun. I wouldn't say this bike is as playful as some other bikes I've ridden recently, but it did not stop me from having an absolute blast on some jumps. The extra weight and the length of this bike feels really stable when you're in the air, which is a very nice, reassuring feeling, especially as you start hitting some larger jumps. This trail air-rated Huntley Gravity Zone, for example, it's got some pretty massive tabletops that are normally above my pay grade, but after a couple runs on this bike, I was able to clear them with confidence. So far we've talked about how this is an average trail bike, a less than sprightly climber, but let's go ahead and talk about what this bike is phenomenal at, and that is going downhill. One of the first times I rode this bike was at Spider Mountain, and good lord, this thing is fast. As I said in the climbing portion, this bike just feels incredibly planted, and finding traction is never an issue for this bike. The rear end of this bike is just so incredibly supple through all of its travel. I often say after every descent, I didn't feel a thing. The bike just tracks incredibly well. It has this incredibly stiff forged rocker, so I never felt the back end flexing. I could take this through some of the roughest stuff I've taken bikes through. It's just a really competent bike when going downhill. I swear every descent I do on this bike, I feel like my balls are 3 times bigger. You can take some questionable lines on this bike and you probably won't pay the price of crashing. Lean this thing over into some berms and you're gonna build more speed than our tiny brains can even process. And I'm just generally faster in all downhill scenarios on this bike. I'm starting to see why people like these bikes. I know I was complaining about the brakes earlier, but most of the time I feel like I don't even need to reach for them because this bike is just so controlled. They don't even need to spec this bike with brakes. There are certain sections of certain trails where I brake check myself on my shorter travel bikes, but that's usually not the case on this bike. I just kind of let go. I know this bike has my back and it can handle pretty much any trail that I can throw at it. I don't think I have enough words in my vocabulary to explain how unbelievably fun this bike is going downhill. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with this bike. Since I live in a relatively flat area with a lot of pedaling involved, I'd much rather grab my short travel trail bike that's way more efficient than this bike. But whenever I do get some sustained downhill, I'm reminded why this bike is so great. If you prioritize going fast downhill over everything else, this bike is excellent. I imagine if you were a pretty decent rider and you raced enduros on this bike, you'd spend a lot of time on the podium. So did the Marin Alpine Trail XR change my opinion on long travel bikes? Yes and no. I certainly have a greater appreciation for these on downhill runs, and if I lived in a more mountainous region, I would definitely ride this bike a lot more. I still prefer a bike that can do a little bit of everything rather than the bike that's kind of a niche and designed to do one thing really well. You could 100% have this as your only bike, but for me, I don't ride enough gnarly descents to justify this being my only bike.
Go. Yes! Ooh.
Lastly, on the Cobra Score, the Alpine Trail XR gets a score of 60 out of 100. It gets impressive scoring in the spec and value categories, with a Cobra Score first of a 10 in the Enduro section, but it's held back by its hefty weight and less than stellar climbing, XC, and trail performance. This bike is exceptional at one thing, hauling downhill, and there is nothing wrong with that. Thank you so much again to Marin for allowing me to review this bike and all the other bikes you've allowed me to review. You've built another incredibly fun bike for riders far manlier than me. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate your time, and until the next one, stay rowdy within reason.